In today's session on the four-level UPRT delivery architecture, we're going to be talking about the most important decision that you need to make as a flight department leader to determine whether your upset prevention and recovery training is actually going to deliver what you need it to do. Let's jump right in. All right, welcome everybody. It's great to be here. This is an important first week we have in our discussion here on the war of loss control in flight, and arguably one of the most important decisions that users of UPRT have to make. So it's going to be a lot of fun. I have here with me Captain Clarke McNeace and Randall Brooks with APS, well-known experts in the industry on upset prevention and recovery training. And guys, I think the interesting part about this is really a UPRT provider agnostic concept. It's really giving the industry a tool to look at the structure of UPRT and how it works and what the fundamental limitations are. So maybe before we get started, any thoughts on that, Otter and Randy, as we jump in?
Well, I think the thing that I'm excited about sharing with this is these are some relatively new concepts that we've been able to derive here at APS based on our experience. But as BJ just suggested, they aren't specific to us. They're general principles that I think everybody objectively is going to see the value in. And so I'm excited about sharing what we have developed here with everybody else.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree. I mean, I would like to encourage the listeners to understand that the challenge that they have is understanding the differences in UPRT and its mitigation levels, and not all UPRT is created equal. So listen in as we're trying to shed some light on those differences and what it can do for you.
Yeah, let me just bring in the first cover slide because I think that is really actually pretty informative as to what we're talking about. So we're going to talk about who the conversation today is calibrated to, but as you can see, the levels we're talking about is the very first level is the existing underlying pilot qualifications. For those of you out there doing everything right, you're doing your training, you're staying current, you're doing your type rating, your 6158, you're doing it all right. That's level one implementation. And unfortunately, level one is perpetuating loss of control in flight as a number one threat to air safety. Not only the most fatal, but it's the most prevalent. We're going to talk about a kind of a safety risk assessment here in a little bit. And as we jump up on the next level is what is the power of simulation on its own, then on aircraft on its own, then integration. And the idea behind it, just because you do upset prevention and recovery training doesn't mean you're getting the same thing out of the program for two reasons. One is the architecture. The second is the ability of the provider to be able to generate the transformational outcomes that you need to actually mitigate your risk. So anything to add on this particular slide, guys, before we jump into the calibrated person we're talking to for today?
I think all of the people watching are going to be familiar with the basic grouping of the platforms that are here represented in the four-level UPRT architecture. But I think it's going to be informative for them to hear what we have found out about the relative contributions of those different platforms.
Yeah, and even though we're gearing this with a baseline understanding that the pilots that we're kind of talking to are jet pilots flying, multi-crew high altitude here. If you're a Cessna pilot or a Pilatus PC-12 pilot or something, like all of these principles still apply as it relates to UPRT.
Exactly. So let's talk about this discussion. Every pilot can listen to this conversation and get something out of it. But remember, to put it in perspective, the architecture being presented here is really calibrated to the high performance turbine power fixed wing operator operating across the full envelope, including high altitude operations. So arguably, it's the most complex environment being operated in, and that's who we're calibrating this for. And so as we get through this discussion, if you are operating a piston, a light twin, whatever it might be, there is an architecture that fits for you. But today, just by the scope, we're not specifically talking about that. Anything to add there, guys, on this calibration? No? Okay. Okay, so a little bit more detail. Here's what the architecture is. We kind of saw it in the opening slide. We saw the different levels. So to be clear, if you're a pilot doing everything right, you're staying current, doing your recurrent training, keeping current, doing all the regulatory training that you need to be the best that you can do, that's level 1. And again, as I mentioned at the beginning, that's what's perpetuating loss of control in flight as the #1 threat to air safety. Advanced simulation is the next one up. Now, to put perspective on that, what this is a dedicated upset prevention and recovery training program where the fundamental training platform is an advanced simulator. Typically, that's a full flight simulator or a fixed base simulator, using that platform now to deliver training. And there's a couple different ways of doing that. There's direct, for example, like you would get at a training center or a specialized UPRT provider, but then there's sophisticated implementations, like, for example, airlines would implement, where it's an entire robust system with FOQA and ASAP informed processes making operational decisions. So there's different levels of simulator implementation. Level 3 now is the all attitude on aircraft risk control. And there's 3 levels on that. And the reason why we say all attitude on aircraft is important to understand that the architecture is not here to serve the minimum standards of the industry. What we're talking about here is what it actually takes to mitigate the risk of loss of control in flight. So in this model, by definition, the on-aircraft platform needs to be an all-attitude capable aircraft. And depending how it's implemented, there's 3 different levels of that: foundational, operational, and advanced. And level 4 now is the integration, essentially, of level 2 and 3 into a dedicated program. So that QR code on the bottom right there is actually where you can actually go to download an overview of the 4-level UPRT architecture to see what this is all about. And it's going to be on each of the slides as we move forward. And in fact, the full book is available on Amazon. You can see the link down there. You get the paperback, you get the ebook version of it. It's about a 100-page resource. It provides a very turnkey tool at the beginning in the first part for flight department leaders. Then part 2 goes into the research that was done to get to the outcomes we're going to present in this presentation. And so before I pass it over to Audra and Randy to comment, is for those of you out there that are looking to take action to mitigate the risk of loss of control in flight, and Audra's going to talk about it in a minute, which is the #1 threat to air safety for every fixed wing operator, determining the architecture that you need in your operation fundamentally limits or enables the risk mitigation that you're going to get out of that implementation that you choose. Okay, so just keep that in mind. All right, now you don't need to be able to read the details on this slide, but those of you that don't operate in the multi-engine high performance turbine operation at all altitudes, what this shows is the complexity of risk that these operators face. It is not the same as the piston operator. It's not the same as the VFR only operator. It's not the same as the operator that only operates at low altitude. It's a very, very complex cross-section of risk that needs to be mitigated. And an effective UPRT program, by design to mitigate this risk, should be giving the ability for operators to use their training in any one of these squares in this matrix. And that's really the key to what an effective UPRT program is. So let me just pause there, guys. I know it's a little bit of an eye test. It's more the concept of the complexity of risk before we get into the safety risk matrix there. Randy, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, we began by talking about the fact that this was constructed to be able to look at who, what, and where, what people are flying, how they're operating. And the reason that we're choosing to speak to the high altitude jet pilots and their operations is that's the most complex. So that considers the most components of this and lets us talk to the entire scheme. But as he said, all of the things that we're going to talk about are objective, and they're going to apply in some level or another to every listener.
Otter, anything else before we move on?
No, that's good.
Okay, well, let me hand it over to you to talk about the safety risk process. In other words, now we're at a safety risk assessment. So, for example, think about the components of UPRT, of safety management system processes. Remember, hazard identification is the first thing. If you can eliminate the hazard, you eliminate the associated risk. Well, when you do that, there's remaining hazards you get exposed to, for example, which could be wake turbulence, it could be cross-check, it could be a variety of different hazards that have an associated risk of loss of control in flight. So Otter, why don't you go ahead and talk to this slide so people understand where they are on this risk matrix and what those arrows represent.
Yeah, I think it's a very good question that a flight department, if you're running an SMS and you're trying to hold true to its principles, you really have to ask the question, where does loss of control in flight fall in our risk? And that's what a risk matrix helps you to decide here. If we look at this from ICAO's SMS definitions, which we will go through here in a second, I think it can help us get clarity on really how much risk. Now, we measure risk by severity and probability, and probably everybody would agree that a loss of control in flight accident from a severity level is catastrophic because most people are going to die on the airplane. They're hazardous, major, or typically results in injuries, but not death there. So the question, though, that most people debate is what is the probability of this loss of control in flight accident? And a lot of people say, it's just not going to happen to us. It's highly improbable, extremely improbable, or whatever. So if we just start at the bottom of the lowest probability, let's see what ICAO says. I mean, ICAO defines extremely improbable as almost inconceivable that the event will occur. Well, it's not inconceivable. Well, then maybe it's improbable. And ICAO defines that as very unlikely to occur, not known to have occurred. Well, that's not the case because we know statistically it is happening. So now that brings us up in probability to remote. And if it follows in remote, then you can see we fall right in the red, which is intolerable risk. And so what is the definition of remote? It's unlikely to occur, but possible, and has occurred rarely. So that seems to fit probably most flight departments. And I submit to you, there are some flight departments where the risk is even higher, depending on their operations, like law enforcement or military, that kind of thing. So if the risk really falls in here and it's intolerable, then by your SMS, you have to mitigate it or you have to shut your operation down. And so the industry agreed mitigation to loss control in flight is UPRT. And that's what these arrows are showing here. With a robust UPRT program, you actually can reduce severity and probability of that risk. And we're going to go into detail a little more here in just a minute.
Randy, anything to add to that?
Well, I think people have to remember that what most operators are doing currently, if they think they are mitigating the risk through approach to stalls in the simulator, unusual attitudes in the simulator, that's what has left us right there in that box that causes loss of control in flight to be the #1 cause of fatalities. So they're not really mitigating anything at all to try and change that and reduce their risk.
And so I think what I would add is for the flight department leaders or even the pilots at a flight department saying, gosh, loss of control is so rare. Okay, it is, but what is more prevalent than loss of control in flight when it comes to fatal accident? Well, nothing. The reigning supreme leader in the catastrophic column is loss of control in flight. Now, when it comes to the remote side of it, it happens very, very often. When it comes to the overall spectrum of all the fatal accidents that occur, loss of control really dominates. So this is a big deal. Ignoring it is ignoring the opportunity to not only mitigate this risk, but what we see with our operators when they comprehensively mitigate this risk, it permeates all the other areas of their flight operation. They have more situational awareness. Their aeronautical decision-making improves. Their flight envelope awareness improves. The system overall starts healing itself for a lot of different reasons. So I think that's enough said on that. We're not, it's not an SMS class here today. We want to jump into this chart. Okay. So this is the big one. This is the chart that is the key one for everybody to look at. And there's the QR code at the bottom to get to download it. So what the L's on the left mean, L1, L2, L3 is level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4. The colors are the same as we saw before. And so the bottom one, underlying pilot certification, is what's perpetuating the threat of loss of control in flight. The current training system is not considered a risk control in this model. The 10% risk mitigation is gratuitous on the possible improvements we might see in the licensing training, with potential improvements that might happen, for example, like with the 141 refresh. So the training's an undedicated solution towards loss of control in flight is really not going to make any difference. Now, what we're seeing on the next level up is simulation. And so when we look at this chart, I just step back and have a look at that blue block, the level 2, is what is the risk mitigating potential of simulation alone. That's what the level 2 block is. When you start looking at the level 3 block, what is the risk mitigation potential of on-aircraft training alone? You'll see that they're not the same by any means. It really, the devil's in the details on that. And then the fourth one to the top, if we start merging those together, what is the potential of risk mitigation for an integrated program? And so there's a lot of information here. I really encourage people, because of the importance of this concept, to download that resource by going to the QR code. It's, I think, 6 pages that does an overview. It gives you the tools you need to be able to make architectural decisions in UPRT. But maybe before we talk a little bit more about it, guys, I know that when we did this, a few things really stood out to us and surprised us. But before we get into that, what are your thoughts you want to share? Maybe we'll start with you, Randy, then Otter, while people just absorb what this is.
Well, when I mentioned at the beginning of this that I was interested in sharing some of this, this is an example. Everybody understands the big blocks of licensing training, simulator training, on aircraft training, and I think to some degree people understand the concept of integrated training. But what we have done is looked at it with greater nuance, which is how exactly are you using the simulator and who is using the simulator? What's the potential effectiveness of using these platforms? And so this is a degree of breakdown that is greater granularity and more specificity in terms of, you know, people trying to identify the loss of control and flight mitigation risk of these various platform or architectural elements as we get into explaining various tiers. So this is a lot more detail than I think the world has seen before.
Right, Otter,
Yeah.
thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'll just clarify here for the listener that, listen, piece together here a second. What we're saying here is, if you are not doing anything beyond what the FAA is requiring you to do, you're at level 1, right? Currently, the stats that we've talked about in terms of loss of control in flight being the #1 causal factor of fatality is being perpetuated by the current regulatory structure. So if you actually want to have an impact on your safety and mitigation of loss control, you have to move yourself up this chart. You have to go up levels in order to do that. But if you just continue to do as is, you won't have an impact.
Yeah, exactly. So the couple things surprised me when we did this, because it was a very scientific process that we went through to be able to determine what these outcomes are. And all of that is available in the book. Okay. If you get the actual download the book or the resource. And in fact, if you're watching this session, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'll send you a free copy of the book by PDF for you to look at, right? This is important information. Just let me know. You don't need to go pay for that at Amazon. Just reach out to me and I'll give it to you. But the most important thing here, I think, that really stood out is I was actually personally surprised how effective simulation actually could be in mitigating the risk of loss of control in flight. So, for example, when I think about a dedicated training center implementation of a dedicated simulator UPRT program, in our experience, I don't think we would have guessed that it was a 40% risk mitigation as its capability. Now, the thing to remember in the bottom part of that box, I don't know if you can see my mouse. Oh, you can, okay. Is remember in the blue box, the primary operational effect is LOC-I probability reduction. So if you think back to what Otter was talking about, it's going vertically down on the risk matrix. You're reducing the likelihood of being exposed to that, and that's due to awareness, recognition, intervention, and prevention. So simulator adds a lot of horsepower on that. This next one up, the 60%, for most operators, even air carriers, that level of success with a UPRT program is generally unachievable. It really takes executive sponsorship, dedicated leadership, a very robust program dedicated to UPRT implementation. I think the poster child of level 2 sophisticated, which is what this stands for, is really Delta Airlines. They saw after 5 million flights in 5 years of a very robust program, a 50% reduction in precursor upset conditions to their risk of loss of control in flight. And just recently, after 8 million flights in 8 years, it's up to 67%. So it's achievable, but that is not a participation-only program. That is a very robust program. And so it's important to understand what that means. Now, the other part that really surprised me is how the limited effect that piston-only on aircraft upset training has for the high-performance multi-engine jet operator at high altitude is that it was much lower than I would have guessed. Those operators really, based on the assessment tools and the way this analysis was done, which we feel is very accurate in our decades of experience, is that jet pilots truly do need jet training, but it needs to be all attitude jet training to start moving up these tiers. I'm going to talk about non-aerobatic jet training in a second, but let me just pause there on levels 2, which is simulator only, and on aircraft level 3, where its primary operational effect is loss of control and flight severity reduction. Should you encounter an upset, the ability for the crew to ensure that it's not fatal is how they mitigate that risk. So let me go to you, maybe Otter, first on this, then to Randy, about any thoughts on level 2 and level 3, and maybe the 40% ones in there that surprised me anyway at level 2 direct and level 3 foundational.
Yeah, I'll remind the listener that these mitigation levels that you're seeing here are the maximum, or that's the potential, right, of mitigation if it is delivered appropriately and robustly. Now, I'll give you an example, right? So I would rather jet pilots come to us and go through our simulator only program than for them to go to an on-aircraft provider, say flying a Decathlon or Citabria, and get 2 flights in that airplane and think they're actually getting better training in those Decathlons in that 2-flight program than they are with us in the simulator. Because in fact, they won't. You won't get 40% mitigation with a 2-flight program flying real airplanes there. So, we have to understand, again, that these mitigations are dependent on the platforms or modalities being used appropriately with a certain intensity.
Yeah, I'm glad to be able to dig into a little bit. Let me start with level 2 simulator training. First, you have the bottom rung there. That is what people can get at a Part 142 training center. And it can vary anywhere from somebody saying, read this, now you're qualified to go UPRT on this multi-engine jet, where they haven't even had the training themselves, or somebody that is a UPRT expert and an expert in and type rated in that aircraft, in which case they're going to be able to do a good job. For the higher tier, that BJ just talked about with Delta Airlines, I think a lot of listeners would be surprised to hear that Delta Airlines is sending their instructors to receive on-aircraft training before they are delivering for a certain number of subject matter experts, not for all of their instructors, so that they can be informed by the human factors that come out of the next level on aircraft training, because there's no way that they can be informed by those human factors in the simulator itself. And then we do, some instructional development as well while they're here. And that is one of the reasons that Delta has had their level of success. And also, it's an ongoing program. It's, something that they are including every time that people are going back. They'll have a little element of UPRT that they're looking at. Now, when we go to the next level of the architecture, the on-aircraft training, I think, I was surprised by this until we had a jet, which we've had here. I'd operated in a jet prior to coming to APS, but I didn't understand fully the contribution until I started using it alongside the piston engine aircraft and saw the latency and control inputs, the roll inertia, the turn rate and radius that are matching the operating envelope of that people are going to have in their aircraft. And then I was instructing for a year in the jet before I got qualified in the high altitude profile. I'd been hearing a lot of customers, a lot of students saying that they thought it was the most impactful training. So I was very anxious to be able to deliver our high altitude profile. And when I did, I saw what they were talking about, because now you're all of a sudden up in the air that they are operating in the majority of the time, where things are handling a little bit differently. They know about it academically. The simulator may or may not have the fidelity to actually work that way, but we have the benefit of having large maneuvering airspace where we can illustrate the actual reduced aerodynamic damping and other things. And so this is an example of just all of the little gaps that we can plug to try and reduce risk. And we haven't even gotten to combining the first two levels together, which we're going to talk about next.
Great. So one thing to mention in here is that most providers have some kind of a value added implementation. So for example, at APS, we deliver at all levels and all tiers of the structure. We deliver everywhere in this diagram. Most providers are at one or two levels, and that's fine. That's what that's where they decided to deliver their solutions, and that's completely fine. So for example, at APS, we offer a virtual reality training, which is a version of type-specific environmental transfer training. We offer extended academic training for off-year study and preparatory study. Those resources, the VR and the extended academics, aren't meaningful enough to change a level or a tier in this structure. Very much like if you're using a non-aerobatic jet airplane. That is not technically jet training, because the value of that, based on this model, isn't sufficient enough for it to go up in a tier. For example, if you're having a provider that has an on-aircraft piston-only UPRT program, and then they have a non-aerobatic jet, well, the value of that is disputable. We don't have them because we think that there's much more value in integrated simulation than a non-aerobatic jet airplane for a lot of reasons. But the point is, to go up the tier in the jet training, to go up the tier in the integrated training, it requires an all-attitude jet to do that. That's really critical to the actual risk mitigation that you need as a high-performance multi-engine jet operator. Same at high altitude. It needs to be designed for all attitudes, all envelopes. You need to see high-altitude thrust-limited slowdowns into the stall. You need to be able to get upset over bank to a high bank angle and be able to mitigate that. And so the all attitude word that keeps appearing in here is very, very intentional, because we are not talking about a normal category piston airplane. We are not talking about a normal category or transport category jet airplane to achieve these levels of risk mitigation. If they were valuable, we would have one. We don't for that reason. So it's really important to understand that this tier and this architecture, as you read through the book, every rational step of the tier and the level going up is based on regulatory guidance and recommendations for best practices. So anything else to add on this slide, guys, before we move on?
I would like to, because I think it's a little counterintuitive for some folks to think that using a transport category aircraft to deliver some element of UPRT isn't going to have that contribution, because they're saying, that's what I fly. Why would I not get a benefit out of flying a platform that's closer to what I operate? And the answer to that is what it is that pilots need to learn in order to mitigate the risk. They certainly don't need how to operate their airplane up in the flight levels. They know how to do that. They do that safely on a regular basis. The things that they need to be exposed to are the things that it would be dangerous to do with that transport category aircraft. We have to show how the laws of aerodynamics change past critical angle of attack. And that's not something that can safely be done in an aircraft that's not been certified to do that. We have to expose pilots to the human factors that they're going to have in situations that it would not be safe to take them to in a transport category aircraft. So at face value, a lot of people think I should train in something that looks like what I've got, but that underestimates the importance of plugging those gaps that we are able to do with the all-latitude capable jet.
And I would say that the best platform for the class-specific, type-specific transport category airplane is the simulator. That is the best platform to do that with integration on aircraft training. And so we've learned that over and over and over again, that, for example, at APS, our program, the reason it serves all these levels is that we are trying to serve the industry based on its recommended best practices. We didn't build the architecture to represent APS. We spent 30 years building APS to support the intent of the industry. So, Otter, anything else you want to add on this chart, maybe to spin off what Randy said?
No, I mean, because we kind of implied it. I just want to make sure the listener understands that if you're a jet pilot flying multi-crew high altitude, what you really want is to be at that highest level up there where it shows you can get 95% mitigation, all right, that top level. And to get that kind of UPRT, you're just not going to get everywhere, all right? And there's very few that can provide that. So, but that really should be your goal, whether you can do it all at once or not. But the point is, if you truly want to have an impact, strive for that highest level.
That said, though, an operator will come in and say, look, we only need simulation training. Okay, we're only comfortable doing simulation training. We want to get that. Well, APS will deliver level 2 direct, which is the bottom blue box there. And the idea behind it is to encourage them to seek more comprehensive training moving forward. Okay, so I think, Otter, this is your point you're talking about, is the best way to get the most outcome for operators is to consider the integration of the level 2 strengths, which, remember, is largely prevention and simulation, with the level 3 strength, which is largely recovery, but bringing them together in an intentional program using the right assets with the right instructors to ensure you get the maximum value out of this potential is the most effective implementation, really, is at the advanced level. So without jumping into the details, anything else to add on this, guys? Okay. All right. So when you take a look at the book, you can actually have a look and see how we did this. We essentially looked at all the industry recommended training that needs to occur. And then we looked at the ability of the platform to be able to deliver that training. And so as you go through it, you'll see the many, many different categories, 37 categories of training to be able to identify how effective the various levels of implementation are. And the idea behind this is not to just do more training. So, for example, maybe the piston operator says, hey, this architecture says that our ability is limited to 40%. Well, we just do more training. No, the architecture sets the fundamental limit of that structure of a UPRT program. It's not about adding more training. You simply can't access what a simulator can do, is the key to it. If you're in simulator only, you simply can't access the risk mitigation value that a non-aircraft program can do, okay? As you go through the book, you look in Appendix B. It talks about the entire scientific process to go through that, where the tables come from. You go through it. It discusses the various ways that the scores were developed, so you can understand what that matrix was that we talked about, that potential matrix. And then if you wish, if you get into the book and you want to see the actual details of how everything was calculated, there's a link in there. You can reach out and we will send you the actual spreadsheets that determine the outcomes of this particular matrix. So my encouragement to you all would be is to download from that URL right now. It's a 6-page overview. It's essentially the toolkit for the flight department leader to make intentional decisions about UPRT architecture to mitigate your risk based on your operational needs. And you're the only one that knows those, but the architecture is going to help you understand how to take action on it. So with that, guys, I don't see a whole lot of questions, but if anybody's out there with questions, please put them in. On the left QR code is to get down that, that free 6-page summary. If you want the whole book, you can buy it on Amazon, either as a paperback or electronic version, or just email me if you went through this event, and I'll send you a free PDF copy right in LinkedIn. So, guys, any things you want to add before we go to any questions we might have?
Yeah, I'll jump in real quick just to remind the listener, listen, this 4-level architecture, understand, this was not originated with APS. This was promulgated, promoted by ICAO, the FAA advisory circulars, EASA, and all that. So it's understanding this is industry vetted guidance that's out there.
That was a great segue, Otter, for a 16-year relationship that the three of us on this call have had, because this process to where we ended up on this call began in 2010, before I was working with you guys through the work of the Royal Aeronautical Society, which was largely through the flight simulation group, and they were going to look at the way that they could fix simulators to help to reduce the loss of control and flight threat. And one of the things that we determined very quickly within the first couple of meetings was, simulators can't do all of the stuff. And so that was the very first time where we started to understand what BJ was explaining before, which is there are things that the simulator just is functionally not capable of. And we began to identify what things could be done in the simulator, what in the aircraft. And then for much of the next 16 years, there has been this debate about, well, aircraft versus simulators. And the answer is it's not one or the other, it's both. All right. And because there are components, the things that we can do in a simulator, such as low altitude recoveries at night that would be unsafe to do in the airplane, can add mitigation that can plug gaps that we can't safely do in the airplane. And so this 4-level architecture is the first time when that has been fully understood and shared to how those things can be integrated. And let me just talk about that integration, because that is not easy. If you have different operators in a simulator and on aircraft that are doing this training, they may use different words. They may have different procedures. They may be using different academic concepts. And so the key is to put those things together so that they are supporting one another. And when you do that, you have the most robust, mitigation to create the most resilient pilots possible.
Otter?
Yeah, nope, I don't have anything further.
So here's a question I think is just a little confusion on what simulation is referring to. So of course, for the simulator side of it, let me just, let's see here. Can I bring that back in? Let's just go back a slide on that. So what we're talking about there for simulation is advanced simulation. We're talking about flight simulation training devices that are used in modern aviation training, certified at different levels, level A, B, C, or D, or level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever it might be. And so the simulation is official simulation software. Anything you guys want to add onto that?
Yeah, there is a debate about what level of simulation is required. And there are circles that say only full motion level D simulators can be used. And then there's, beyond that, only extended envelope simulators that have extended envelopes past to the critical angle of attack can be used. And this is where the instructor comes in, because an instructor that knows how to use a simple advanced aviation training device, a non-motion device that's got good visuals, can emphasize the right principles in that device. In our VR, we use X-Plane 11, X-Plane 12, but we are not using, we're using that to get the approximate aero model so that it's exhibiting correct behavior. But in any of these cases, you can't use it beyond the fidelity of, beyond the boundaries of where valid simulation can be done. And so that's important, that the instructor understands the limits, that they can use whatever device up to the highest level extended envelope. You can still exceed the capabilities of that. So that the instructor's got to understand that and be able to use the platform correctly.
Yeah, well, let me just add to that real quickly, because it might be on some folks' minds about simulation, especially since there are now some simulator providers that are providing dedicated UPRT in it. And just remind everybody that even a level D sim, only 7% of the motion cues are actually valid, and none of the motion cues are actually valid in an upset. In fact, Airbus recommends that if you're going to do upset training in a simulator, you should turn the motion off, because they consider it negative training. Now, Boeing has a little different philosophy. They say, well, yeah, true, but we say turn the motion on because we consider it a distraction. So two different ways of viewing it, but there's clear limitations to doing simulator-only training. Motion is one of the limitations, human factors, and that kind of thing. So this is why integration, or integrating that simulator training with on-aircraft training, can be so robust and comprehensive when you overlay the two platforms.
So one thing here, guys, that I wanted to take a look at, let me just get to the table of contents. I just pulled the book up here. Let me go ahead and show that right here, is that I can add it to the screen. It's for everybody. You'll notice that there's a lot of great tools in here, but down here in Appendix A are common questions. And so often people are a little bit reluctant to ask questions because they don't want to ask a bad one. And there are no bad or wrong questions in this. But this whole appendix goes through many common questions, all right? It talks about fidelity that Randy talked about. It talked about insurance carrier acceptance of training. It talks about, I've never had an upset. Do I really need this training, and how we address that? So a lot of different areas of the questions you'd have related to the architecture are already addressed in the book itself. So I would suggest you go to do that. And then the Appendix B part that I had talked about, this is where you go through the scientific method and how these results were determined. So anything to add on that, guys, at all? Okay. All right. So with that, I think we're ready to wrap up here, guys. Any final comments for people? The architecture is a new concept, but for those people who are really trying to implement training to save their lives, you need to understand what your risk profile is and what risk you want to mitigate. And that really requires a robust safety risk management process to do that. And once you determine the risk to be mitigated, what UPRT architecture can do it, because they're not at all the same. UPRT doesn't just equal UPRT. Simulator, on-aircraft, and integrated training have very, very different capabilities and strengths. And as Otter mentioned, the target really should almost always be integrated training. So I know that APS, for example, when you select an on-aircraft program, we will upgrade you from level 3 to level 4 at no charge, because we want to make sure that you have the right training to mitigate your risk. So let's go around the room here for final comments. Let's start with you, Randy, and then on.
Well, I started out talking about the fact that I was looking forward to sharing this information. But pilots all have opinions, and I would be shocked if everybody listening agreed to everything that they heard. And that is great. we welcome that debate, because this is the most important safety aspect that we face as an industry, is loss of control in flight. It's not the second or third leading cause of fatalities, it's number one. And so if having honest debate about the contributions of these various platforms in this 4-level UPRT architecture helps us to get past some misconceptions and get to the truth behind these contributions, then we look forward to having those discussions.
Yeah, and I'll just add that. Listen, download the documents here, look through it. But if you don't have time to get through the whole thing, give us a call. I mean, we'd be happy just to chat about it there with you, and share these concepts, share what we've learned over nearly 3 decades of delivering full-time UPRT, and this is all we do. This is what we focus on. This is not a side gig for us. And so we've got a lot of insight that I think could be very insightful for flight department leaders.
Absolutely. And, I think it's just really, really important that we understand that this presentation today was for a certain cross-section of the aviation industry and its most complex implementation that pilots face. So with that, I think to your point, Otter, download it. We have a 1-page version, a 6-page version, a 98-page version. All right. So make sure that you take advantage, at least start the process. If you're making decisions, this decision, the architecture, is the most important step you can make to get on the right track to actually overcoming the risk and threat of loss of control in flight. So with that, we'd like to thank everybody for being here. Randy and Otter, thanks for being here. And we're going to see everybody next week talking about UPRT delivery excellence, which is how an operator, no matter what architecture they're implementing, how do they actually deliver the outcomes promised by that level of the architecture. So with that, thanks everybody. Appreciate all your time today. And we will see you hopefully next week. Take care.